The sound of a search ending is the worst sound in the world because it sounds like a zipper closing on a plastic body bag. But this time it was just the heavy canvas of the command tent being sealed shut for the night. Eric Roberts sat on the rusted tailgate of his truck and listened to that zipper, and it felt like a door slamming shut on his chest. He held a cup of coffee that had turned into brown sludge hours ago, watching the people around him pack up their lives. Grab your coffee and stay with me, because the reason the search failed wasn't what anyone thought, and what was waiting in the dark was something no machine could ever see. The young volunteers were laughing near the bus, high-fiving each other because they were finally going home to warm beds and hot showers, and they didn't understand that their relief was an insult to the 6-year-old girl still somewhere out in the dark. Eric wanted to scream at them to stop smiling, but he didn't have the energy left in his body to be angry, so he just sat there rubbing his bad knee and feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of failure settling over the parking lot. Sheriff Miller walked over, looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 4 days, and he didn't even have the courage to look Eric in the eye when he spoke. Miller leaned against the truck and stared at the dirt, kicking a loose stone with his boot as he said the words Eric had been dreading since the sun went down. He told Eric it was over, that the state police were pulling the funding, and the helicopter was grounded, and the temperature was dropping to numbers that made survival impossible. He showed Eric a piece of paper with a graph on it, a cold white sheet that said 0% probability in black ink, as if a little girl's life was just a math problem that could be solved and filed away in a cabinet. Hi, my amazing friends and family. Welcome back to Vigilant Heart Tales. Before we jump deep into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing all your names and countries. And don't forget to check out the other stories on the channel. Tomorrow I've got another crazy one coming that I know you'll enjoy. Alright, let's get into it. Eric looked at the paper and then he looked at the woods, which were a wall of black pine and shadow against the night sky. He asked Miller if the math accounted for the fact that Amanda was wearing a denim jacket and light-up sneakers, or if the math knew that she was scared of the dark. Miller just sighed, a long, rattling breath that smelled of stale tobacco, and told Eric to go home and get some sleep because they would switch to recovery mode in the morning, which was the polite police way of saying they were done looking for a person and were starting to look for a corpse. The word recovery hung in the air between them like poisonous smoke. Eric felt sick to his stomach, not just because of the coffee, but because he remembered the last time he heard that word, 3 years ago with a boy named Justin, and he remembered exactly how heavy a child feels when you carry them out of the woods too late. He looked down at his feet where Harry was tied to the bumper. Harry was a Belgian Malinois with a gray muzzle and eyes that usually held a calm, steady intelligence, but tonight those eyes were wide and wild. Most dogs would be asleep after 96 hours of searching, curled up in a ball to escape the cold, but Harry was standing rigid at the end of his leather lead. The dog was pacing back and forth in a tight, nervous figure eight, his claws clicking on the asphalt. Every few seconds he would stop and stare at the tree line, letting out a high, vibrating whine that sounded like a tea kettle about to boil over. Miller tried to tell Eric that the dog was just tired and cold, claiming that Harry was reacting to the stress of the team packing up, but Eric knew his dog better than he knew himself. He knew that Harry didn't whine when he was tired. He slept. This wasn't exhaustion. This was a frantic, desperate signal that something was wrong, something that the humans with their maps and their radios were missing completely. A young deputy named Kyle walked past them carrying a plastic case, the guy who operated the thermal drone. Kyle was smug, the kind of kid who trusted a screen more than his own eyes, and he stopped to tell Eric that he had flown over Sector 4 twice. He tapped his tablet and said the thermal camera was perfect, that it could see a rabbit from 500 feet up, and if the girl was there she would be glowing like a beacon. He said the woods were empty and that Eric was wasting his time trusting an old dog over $100,000 piece of military technology. Eric looked at the kid's clean uniform, and then he looked at the scar running down Harry's nose, a souvenir from saving Eric's life in a meth lab bust. He realized in that moment that the technology was the problem because machines don't have hearts and they don't have instincts. A machine looks for heat, but a dog looks for life. Eric stood up, and his knee popped with a sound like a dry branch snapping, sending a spike of pain up his leg that almost made him stumble, but he ignored it because the pain was the only thing making him feel real. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out his radio, the heavy black brick that connected him to the sheriff and the rules and the orders to give up. He held it for a second, feeling the weight of his career and his pension in his hand, and then he tossed it onto the passenger seat of his truck. Miller's eyes went wide and he shouted Eric's name, warning him that if he went back out there he was insubordinate, that there would be no backup and no ambulance if he fell into a ravine. Eric didn't answer him because there was nothing left to say to a man who had already quit. He walked around to the back of the truck and untied Harry's leash. As soon as the knot came loose, the dog stopped whining. Harry didn't look at Eric for comfort. He turned his body toward the woods and pulled on the leather strap with such force that he choked himself, his tail rigid and his ears locked forward. It wasn't the behavior of a confused animal. It was the behavior of a soldier who knows the mission isn't done. Eric wrapped the leash around his gloved hand and zipped his jacket up to his chin, turning his back on the lights and the warmth and the people who were leaving. He stepped off the pavement and into the mud, letting the dog drag him away from the safety of the parking lot and into the freezing darkness of the trees. The transition from the parking lot to the forest was violent. One moment there was the hum of engines and the murmur of voices, and the next there was nothing but the sound of the wind tearing through the tops of the pines and the crunch of frozen leaves under Eric's boots. The darkness was absolute, a heavy blanket that swallowed the beam of his flashlight after only a few yards. It was colder here, a biting chill that found the gaps in Eric's collar and seeped into his bones within minutes. He followed Harry, stumbling over roots and pushing through thickets of briars that tore at his uniform and scratched his face. Harry wasn't tracking a scent on the ground anymore. He was air scenting, keeping his head high and snapping his jaws at the wind as if he were trying to catch invisible particles of fear drifting on the breeze. Eric's knee was screaming with every step, a constant, throbbing agony that made him want to sit down and quit, but every time he slowed down, Harry would turn back and look at him with amber eyes that burned with an intensity that shamed him into moving. They walked for an hour, pushing deeper into the woods than the volunteers had dared to go, into the red zone, where the terrain was steep and dangerous. The doubt started to creep into Eric's mind, a whispering voice telling him that Miller was right, that the drone was right, that he was just a broken-down old cop chasing a ghost because he couldn't handle the guilt. He pictured Amanda alone in this dark, wondering if anyone was coming for her, and the thought made him push harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs. Suddenly, Harry stopped. He didn't just slow down. He slammed on the brakes, his body going completely still. They were in a small, dense clearing surrounded by ancient ferns that came up to Eric's waist. The wind had died down here, leaving a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Harry wasn't looking at the ground. He was staring at a patch of thick underbrush near the base of a rocky outcrop. The dog took a step forward, low to the ground, and then another, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't make a sound. He crawled under the briars and vanished from sight. Eric followed him, cursing as the thorns snagged his jacket, forcing his large frame through the tangle of vegetation. When he broke through to the other side, he found Harry lying on his stomach at the edge of what looked like a pile of dead leaves. But as Eric shined his light closer, he saw that it wasn't just leaves. It was a hole, a fissure in the earth, narrow and jagged, hidden completely by the forest floor. It was a sinkhole, the kind that opened up in this part of the country without warning, A natural trap that could swallow a deer or a man or a little girl without leaving a trace. Eric felt a cold shock of realization wash over him as he understood why the drone had failed. The drone was looking for heat on the surface, but the Earth is an insulator. If she was down there, the ground would have masked her body heat from the camera. The machine hadn't made a mistake, it just hadn't looked deep enough. Eric crawled to the edge of the hole, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pointed his flashlight into the abyss, the beam cutting through the damp air, illuminating wet stone and darkness. He took a deep breath, terrified of what he might see or what he might not see, and he called out her name. Amanda! His voice cracked, sounding small and weak in the vast silence of the woods. He waited for a cry, a whimper, anything. But there was no answer. Just the dripping of water and the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears. Harry whined again, staring into the hole, and Eric knew that the silence didn't mean she was gone. It just meant he had to go down into the dark to find her. Eric stared down into the black void of the sinkhole, and he knew that if he climbed down there without a rope he might never climb back out. But he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he walked away. He sat on the muddy lip of the fissure and dug the heels of his boots into the soft earth, taking a breath that rattled in his chest before he pushed himself off the edge and slid into the darkness. The slide was uncontrolled and violent, his body tearing through roots and slamming against wet rocks that scraped his skin raw through his uniform, and when he hit the bottom he landed hard on his bad ankle. The pain was immediate and blinding, a hot spike of agony that made him gasp and nearly vomit, but he forced himself to swallow the bile because he saw something blue in the beam of his flashlight. It was a patch of bright, synthetic blue nylon that didn't belong in a world of brown mud and gray stone. Eric ignored the screaming pain in his leg and crawled across the floor of the cave on his hands and knees, the freezing mud soaking instantly through his pants. The air down here was different. Heavy and still and so cold that it hurt to breathe, acting like a natural refrigerator that had trapped the freezing night air. He reached the blue shape and his heart stopped beating for a terrifying second because it was her. It was Amanda. She was curled into a tight fetal ball with her face pressed into the dirt, looking so small and so still that she looked like a discarded doll. Eric reached out a trembling hand to touch her shoulder, and she felt like a block of ice, hard and unyielding under his fingers. The fear that washed over him wasn't a panic. It was a heavy, crushing sadness that threatened to drown him right there in the dark. He thought he was too late, that the math and the sheriff and the drone were right, and he was just an old fool who had found a body instead of a child. But he refused to accept it. He ripped the glove off his right hand with his teeth and spat it into the mud, pressing his bare, warm fingers against the side of her neck. His own pulse was thumping so loud in his fingertips that he couldn't tell if he was feeling her life or his own. He closed his eyes and held his breath, pressing harder, begging the universe for a miracle. And then he felt it. It was faint and thready, a tiny flutter against his skin that was weaker than a moth's wing, but it was there. She was alive. The relief hit him so hard he almost collapsed, but he knew that alive didn't mean safe. She was deep in hypothermia, her body shutting down one system at a time to protect her heart. Eric grabbed his tactical pouch and tore it open, his fingers clumsy and numb as he ripped the package of the emergency foil blanket. The sound of the foil crinkling was deafening in the quiet cave as he shook it out. He carefully rolled Amanda onto her back, wincing at how stiff her limbs were, and wrapped the silver sheet around her, tucking it under her boots and pulling it up over her head like a hood. The foil was cold, so Eric unzipped his heavy police jacket and pulled her bundled body against his chest, wrapping his own coat around the both of them. He sat there in the mud, rocking back and forth, rubbing her back vigorously to generate friction and heat. He pressed his face into her dirty, matted hair and whispered to her, telling her that he was there, that Harry was waiting, that she was going home. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he kept talking because he needed to believe she was still in there. Minutes dragged by like hours. He gave her his body heat until he was shivering uncontrollably, his teeth chattering in the dark. Then he felt a shift. A small, ragged exhale against his neck. Her body hitched, a tiny spasm of movement. Eric pulled back slightly and shone the light on her face. Her eyelids fluttered. They didn't open, but they moved. Her lips parted and a small, weak cough escaped her throat. It was the most beautiful sound Eric had ever heard. "I've got you," he choked out, tears finally spilling over and cutting warm tracks through the mud on his face. "I've got you, baby girl." Getting out was going to be the hardest thing Eric had ever done. He looked up at the opening of the sinkhole, 12 feet above them, a jagged mouth of light gray against the black rock. His ankle was useless, throbbing with a dull fire every time he put weight on it. He couldn't climb and carry her, but he had to. He tied the foil blanket around her with a piece of paracord from his belt so it wouldn't slip off, and he hoisted her 40-pound weight onto his good shoulder. He gritted his teeth and grabbed a thick tree root that had punched through the ceiling of the cave. He pulled. His muscles screamed in protest, and his bad knee buckled, sending a shockwave of pain up his spine that made his vision blur white. He slipped, sliding back down 2 feet, scraping his chin against the rock. He groaned, a guttural sound of frustration and pain. From the rim of the hole, Harry's head appeared. The dog was staring down, whining, pacing frantically along the edge. "Back!" Eric wheezed. "Back, Harry!" The dog moved back, giving Eric space. Eric didn't let himself think about the pain. He thought about the zipper on the body bag. He thought about the empty look in the sheriff's eyes. He found a foothold in the shale and pushed, screaming through his clenched teeth as he drove his body upward. Inch by inch, he clawed his way up the wall of the sinkhole. Dirt crumbled into his eyes. His fingernails tore. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. When his hand finally slapped onto the muddy grass at the surface, he didn't have the strength to pull himself up. He just hung there, gasping, half in and half out, holding the girl with one arm and the earth with the other. Then he felt a tug. Harry had grabbed the back of Eric's tactical vest with his teeth. The dog planted his paws in the mud and pulled backward, growling deep in his chest with the effort. It was just enough. With one final agonizing heave, Eric rolled over the edge and collapsed onto the forest floor. He lay there for a minute, staring up at the sky, watching the gray light of dawn beginning to bleed through the trees. He checked Amanda again. She was still warm. She was still breathing. The walk back to the road was a blur of misery and determination. Eric limped, dragging his bad leg, clutching the silver bundle to his chest like it was made of glass. Harry walked right beside his leg, pressing his shoulder against Eric's thigh as if trying to hold him up. The woods were waking up. Birds were starting to sing, indifferent to the drama that had just played out below them. The sun began to crest over the mountains, casting long golden beams of light through the mist, turning the forest into a cathedral of light and shadow. It was the golden hour, that magical time of morning where everything looks soft and hopeful. Eric stumbled out of the tree-line and onto the gravel access road just as the convoy of police SUVs was starting their engines. The sound of the motors died instantly as the first officer spotted them. A shout went up. Not a word, just a loud, shocked cry. Eric saw Sheriff Miller standing by the lead truck. Miller dropped his clipboard. He stood there with his mouth open, looking like he was seeing a ghost. Eric kept walking. He didn't stop until he was 10 feet away from them. His legs finally gave up. The adrenaline that had been holding him together evaporated, and he sank to his knees in the dirt. He didn't fall, he just lowered himself down, cradling Amanda. The image was striking, a battered, muddy man in a uniform kneeling in the golden sunrise, holding a child wrapped in silver foil, with a gray-muzzled dog standing guard beside him. The silence in the clearing was absolute. No one moved. They were too stunned. Eric looked down at Amanda. Her eyes opened. They were glassy and confused, but they were open. She looked up at him, blinked, and then her gaze shifted to the dog. She reached a small, dirty hand out from the foil and touched Harry's nose. Harry licked her fingers, his tail giving a slow, gentle thump against Eric's leg. That small movement broke the spell. Sheriff Miller ran forward, tears streaming down his face, shouting for the medics. The other officers rushed in, surrounding them. But Eric didn't let go. Not yet. He looked up at Miller, his eyes exhausted but fierce. "The machine missed her," Eric whispered, his voice raspy and broken. "She was underground. The ground masked the heat." Miller fell to his knees beside Eric, placing a hand on the foil blanket, shaking his head in disbelief. "I'm sorry," Miller sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Eric." Eric looked at Harry, who was panting softly, looking proud and tired. "Don't apologize to me," Eric said softly, leaning his head against the dog's flank. "Apologize to him." The medics gently took Amanda from his arms, and as the weight left him, Eric felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He watched them load her into the ambulance, watched the oxygen mask fog up with her breath, and he knew that for the rest of his life, he would never again care what a computer said about survival. He put his arm around Harry's neck and buried his face in the dog's fur, and as the ambulance siren finally wailed to life, cutting through the morning air, Eric Roberts sat in the dirt and cried, not out of sadness, but because for the first time in a long time, the good guys had won. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.